One of the most important skills when you're shooting in manual mode is understanding your camera's inbuilt light meter. Understanding how the light meter works and learning how to read and interpret the display is the key to nailing exposure every time, and it's a really powerful tool. When you look through the viewfinder, you're going to see something that looks like this. Or if you're shooting on Nikon, it's the other way around. The numbers are just reversed and you'll see something like this. The camera is basically telling you whether your image is correctly exposed or not by using these displays. So when you see a setting like this, where the indicator is over the 0, it's telling you that based on the settings you've chosen, that image is correctly exposed. When you see this setting, the camera is telling you that your image is underexposed by 1 stop. And when you see this image in the viewfinder, the camera is telling you that the shot that you've taken is overexposed by 1 stop. Now, the technology that does this is amazing. Most situations that you shoot in, the camera actually does a fantastic job at reading the light in any given situation. But there's a couple of situations where the camera's light meter gets really confused. If you've got a scene where there's lots of bright white light around, like maybe a snowy scene, or if you've got someone who's backlit or against has lots of white around them, or if you're shooting a scene where it might be quite dark and moody, maybe you've got someone in a black room on a black chair wearing black clothes, lots of dark colours, or performers on stage where it's very dark and then there's small areas of light. The camera meter gets confused by these situations because the camera meter is reading light that's reflected from your subjects rather than the actual light that is hitting your subjects. The best way to guarantee the most accurate exposure is to use a light meter. Now, a light meter is a small handheld device that measures the light that is actually hitting your subject. So if you use a light meter, you're going to get the most accurate exposure. The problem with that is handheld light meters are an extra expense, and there is a workaround. And basically, if you understand how the different metering modes on a camera work, and you understand how your camera sees light, there is a workaround for all those difficult situations, which is not every time you shoot, but if you're aware of it and know these workarounds, you'll always get great exposures. So let's have a look at our camera and find out how we can change the metering modes to suit the sort of lighting situation that we're shooting in. So on most DSLRs, there is a little icon it's a button on the camera. If you've got a higher end camera, it kind of looks like a little eye, and you can change the different kinds of metering modes to suit the style that you're shooting in. Now, whether this is a button on your camera or you need to go into your menu and find it, you'll need to check with your specific camera manufacturer to find out exactly where that is. On this Canon 5D Mark III, it's located in the top, and it's just a matter of hitting that button and you can adjust the metering modes. Let's have a look at the metering modes on a camera. On the screen now, I've got the icons for the metering modes for both Canon and Nikon. They both do very similar things. If you have a different camera, I suggest you have a look at the camera manual and you'll find that they're very similar. They may have slightly different names, but the basis of what they do is very similar. So the top two on a Canon called evaluative, and on Nikon, the coolest name for a metering mode, the matrix. These are the default settings on your camera. So basically, matrix or evaluative metering divides your image into segments and takes a reading based on the average of brightest to darkest. So this is a good all-rounder, and I use matrix metering as a starting point for my daylight shoots. On the screen now, I've got an image taken at one of my friend Lou and Mitch's weddings, and this is shot using matrix or evaluative metering, and this is pretty much where the camera absolutely nails it every time. The camera's taken all the bright areas of the image, like the sky and the sun shining on the pier. It's calculated that there are some shadow areas of the image under the pier. There's water reflected around, and basically it's calculated an average of all the components in this image and come up with a very good exposure. It actually gets it right every time when you're not giving your camera anything too complicated to photograph. Knowing that the camera, or Hans as I like to put it, the guy who invented the system in the camera, works is a good way to understand the metering system. Now, Hans, the guy who developed the camera metering system, clever guy that he is, has developed this system based on exposing for an average of every scene. So if you took all the skin tones in the world and you blended them together, the average skin tone would be mid-suntanned skin. And if you took all those skin tones and you converted them to black and white, mid-suntanned skin would look something like the middle grey in this diagram, which is a mid-grey, which is the average between bright white and black. That mid-grey is the average, middle grey average that Hans bases all his exposures on. So when the camera takes a light reading of any scene and it's measuring accurately as a scene is correctly exposed, it's basing that on the average of a mid-grey. And so the average skin tone based on the camera's metering system, is going to be a mid-sun tanned skin, which is great. If you're photographing someone with mid-sun tanned skin, you're always going to get the correct exposure. But what happens if you're photographing someone with very, very dark skin, or you're photographing someone with very, very fair skin? The camera takes a meter reading off that skin tone, and it's always going to tell you that the correct reading, the correct tone, is going to be that mid-grey average. And this is where it becomes problematic. So let's have a look why that is and break it down in a real life situation. So let's imagine let's go back to my friend Lou, who was getting married. Here's a shot of Lou taken using matrix metering. Now, Lou has very fair skin, and the camera has metered her skin tone as the average, and it's actually done a pretty good job metering. So there's detail in the sky, there's detail in the veil, so it's looking white, and her skin tone has been read as an average. The problem is that average is showing too much detail, and I don't think her skin tone looks particularly flattering in this light. To me, overall, the image is looking dull, even though according to the camera and the camera meter, the reading is absolutely correct. And we can see that when I convert the image to black and white, you can see that her skin tone is in fact that mid-grey average. It's middle, so the camera meter is absolutely correct in the reading that it's given me. This is the average reading. But average is just that, it's average. And if you're going to the trouble of shooting in manual mode, I think you're going to want better than average images. So on the screen now, I've got a similar image. This time I overexposed by 1 stop. So you can see the camera meter is now over into 1 stop over the correct setting, and I have lost some detail in my veil, but I think her skin tone looks really beautiful in this image, and that's what I'm concerned with. If you were shooting this and it was absolutely crucial that you got all the detail in the veil, then you may consider dropping the exposure down a little bit. But I think for this, it was all about capturing the mood and the feeling of the day, and also capturing her beautiful skin tone. And I think this way it's just a much brighter, beautiful, more natural shot. So we can see in this example, similar thing. I've taken my matrix metering, and the camera has given me the average settings, mid-grey, and it's looking overall, it's well exposed, but again, it's the average. If I convert it to black and white, you can see that it is, in fact, her skin tone matches that of a mid-grey. So the camera has taken a reading based on giving her a mid-grey skin tone. But overall, to me, the image is looking a little heavy and dull. So if I take the same procedure as the earlier image and I overexpose by 1 stop, you can see that overall the image is looking brighter, her skin tone is looking much more natural and closer to the fair skin tone that she has. And if you convert that to a black and white, you can see that the image is in fact now on the lighter scale of grey. It's overexposed according to the camera meter, but based on what's average. So when I'm talking about metering for skin tones, the camera metering system and the camera's autofocus system are connected. So where you set your focus point on the camera is also how the camera meters. So if I'm metering off skin tone, what I mean by that is I am taking a reading off the skin tone. So in order to take a light reading off the skin tone, what I do is I will move my focus point until it is hitting part of the skin that I want to expose for. I will take a reading off that, and based on what my camera is telling me, I know that it is wanting to give me an average reading, and then I will increase my exposure by half. I'll try a half a stop first and then to a stop, and have a look at the back of the camera on the LCD screen and make sure I've got the correct exposure. Once I'm happy with the exposure, and let's have a look at the next image where I overexposed, and you can see I've overexposed by one stop and I've got an exposure that I'm happy with. The skin tone is looking beautiful. That's what I'm concerned about in this image. I have lost some detail in the veil, but I can actually bring that back in post-production, and the reading has been taken off the skin tone. And when I go back to compose my actual shot, I will go back and focus on the eye and not change my earlier exposure off the skin tone. When we're working with darker skin tones, the camera's metering system does the opposite. So the camera's meter will average a very dark skin tone back to a mid-grey, which is too light. So you will end up needing to compensate by underexposing the skin by half to one stop. So that's something just to remember when you're photographing very dark skin tones, that the camera will always want to bring that skin tone back to a mid-grey, and it's always going to overexpose the skin tone. When you've got a very fair skin tone, the camera again is always going to want to bring that back to a mid-grey, and it's going to underexpose that skin tone and give you a darker skin tone than you actually need. Now, my preferred method of metering is to use matrix metering and to use the techniques that I've just outlined. There are a couple of other metering modes that you might like to consider, and the first one I want to talk about is center-weighted metering. Now, center-weighted metering basically is the camera gives more emphasis to the scene in the center of the frame. So it measures light from the whole scene but places more emphasis in the center. This is a good mode to use for portraits, as it reads the area around the center of the frame, right where your portrait subject might be. So center weighting metering also compensates for brightly lit backgrounds. The other one you might want to consider is spot metering. Spot metering takes a single reading from a small area of the center of the frame, and this is a good mode if you need to get accurate light reading from a small area on a brightly lit plane. So that might be a backlit couple walking in the distances, and many photographers love using it for portrait because it allows you to accurately meter off skin tones. The problem with spot metering is it measures such a tiny area that if you slightly misplace the spot you're metering off, and you might accidentally hit, say, the bright area of a veil on a wedding dress, or a dark patch like at the part of the beard on a man's face, or a mole, this could change your exposure, and it will vary drastically based on where you're metering off. So if you're going to be using spot, use it with caution.